Hi, I'm Rebecca Kemp Brent. All of us have a lot of tech to carry when we travel or when we stay at home, and I want to show you how to make this great tech pouch, which you can make any size you need to fit whatever gear you're carrying. When I saw this fantastic Tim Holtz fabric that has the look of antique postage, the first thought that came to mind was the old airmail envelopes. And it's especially easy to make from this fabric collection because it has this great diagonal stripe print, which means that I could cut my binding on the straight grain, but it still has the look of bias stripes. I just don't have the extra fabric and extra work. I'm also using some hardware on the bag, which is functional. These swivel hooks are going to let the handle move around a lot, but it also carries through the sort of vintage steampunk look that we have in this bag. So let me show you a couple of the details here. I've used a couple of different kinds of thread. One of them is this heavier weight craft thread. It's too big to go through the eye of the needle, but I've used it to accent my strap by couching it, which means you just lay the thread down on top of your fabric and then you zigzag across it with a thinner thread that you can put through the eye of the needle. And then I also have a cotton thread, which I like to use sometimes when I'm sewing on cotton fabrics, and the colors coordinated so well with the fabrics that this is what I use to do my general sewing. Back to the craft thread again, you'll notice that I've sewn on my D-rings with a nice heavy stitch, and this is actually a buttonhole stitch that I stitched by hand with the heavier craft thread, just to give it a little bit of a different look instead of putting fabric tabs on top of my envelope. The first technique that you'll need when you're making a bag like this is the quilted fabric to pad the outside. And I'm actually going to use 3 layers of fabric. This is my lining layer, and I'm going to set that aside for the moment. And then I have my exterior, and I also have a layer of this great foam stabilizer. This is actually a piece of foam that has a tricot knit laminated on both sides. It started out in the automotive industry, so if you feel over the top of your head in your car, you're probably going to find a piece of this riding there. It sometimes comes with a fusing agent already on one or both sides, which makes it even better for the project because you can just put your exterior fabric on the fusible side and fuse everything in place. You'll notice that I'm not putting my lining in my fabric sandwich right now. I don't actually want to quilt the lining to the exterior. And my reason for that is that I want to keep the lining completely smooth as just an extra layer of protection for the tech that I'm slipping inside the bag. Now, I love quilting. I love the textured look that it gives to your fabric when you have a grid quilted on top, but I don't like the marking process. That to me is just work. So I'm going to use painter's tape or masking tape, which comes in different sizes, and take one of my rulers. Most of these rulers will have a 45-degree line marked on them. So I'll just lay that 45-degree line right on the edge of my fabric and then tear off a piece of my tape, lay it on my fabric, and now I have a stitching guide, and I'll take this to the machine and I'll sew on both sides. After I've done those first 2 lines of stitching, you can peel the tape up and move it to the next spot and use it over and over again. For a project this size, you may need just 1 or 2 lengths of tape, but it's so much easier than doing the markings and then having to remove the markings from your fabric later. Now, if you'll come with me to the machine, I'll show you some of the other techniques that I use to put the bag together. I close my tech pouches with a hook and loop fastener. This is a great, easy way to do it, but I have always been a little bit bothered by the sort of unfinished look that you can have with those fasteners. So I'm going to show you a technique that you'll wind up with a fastener that's actually neatly finished so it looks just like this. What you do first is just trim the corners a little bit so that you have sort of an oval shape, and then mark your position, and you'll notice I have a really high-tech basting tool here. It's kind of hard to hold something like this in position, especially these stiff hooks, so I just use plain old office tape and put a piece of that across. And when I'm finished with the stitches, it tears away and it doesn't gum up your needle. There's not enough sticky on this for it to be a problem. So that holds it in place, I think, better than pins even. And I've been careful about where I positioned the hook side so that when I am either reaching into the pouch or I'm sliding my tech into the pouch, this scratchy hook is going to be on the outside and there's no risk of it scratching or damaging a screen. Now you can see I've already straight stitched around the perimeter of this, and I'm going to go to my sewing machine and set this up for a zigzag stitch with a satin length. It's kind of easy for me to remember these settings because it's 3 millimeters wide and 0.3 millimeters long. Then I'm going to set this under the machine and make sure that I have it positioned so that that zigzag is going to fall right off the edge of my hook and loop fastener. And then when I come to the curve, stop every few stitches and lift your presser foot and pivot. And you just keep going until you've stitched all the way around, and then you can tie off your ends and cut your threads. Now, obviously, I stopped before I got all the way around on this one, but you can still see what I was doing. And sometimes I find that, especially on the hook side where this is kind of stiff, it will separate my threads and it doesn't have a really nice satiny finish. If that happens to you, just go around again, right on top of the first row of stitches. With 2, you'll get perfect coverage. After I have my Velcro in place, then I'm ready to take my lining fabric and put it on the wrong side of my quilted fabric. And I'm going to baste all the way around the edges of this, about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge. I'm not big on basting for the most part, but trust me, this is one project where you do want to baste to make sure that your edges stay put. So you can see this one I've already basted all the way around the edges, and then we're ready to start with this fun binding. And the first thing I do is just put the binding on the square end. That one's really easy peasy because it's just trimmed. You don't have to worry about finishing the edges of it because they're going to be covered. But that brings up the question, what do we do when we have the edges at the bottom that aren't covered by something else? And I'll show you that technique as part of this assembly process. So I fold up 8 inches of my pouch, and it's really handy to have something like these clips to hold this together because with the thickness, sometimes pins don't work so well. And because this is so thick, even though I have it basted once, I'm going back to my machine and I'm going to use a zigzag stitch. This one I want to have a little bit longer length, so I'll just set it back to its usual length and width. And again, I'm going to position this stitch so that it falls over the edge of my fabric. And by doing that, I'm basting the folded edge together with the other part of the pouch, but I'm also compressing the seam allowances just a little bit, and that's going to make it a lot easier for me to sew the binding in place. Now, this is my technique for finishing those binding ends, and I do this kind of binding completely by machine, mainly because it's more functional. It's not a show quality quilt, and I'd rather do the machine work. So I'm going to start by putting the raw edges of my binding along the raw edges of my pouch and leave about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch at the end. Then we set up for a straight stitch. And I'm going to make sure that my stitch is 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of my presser foot, or you can use a 1/4 inch foot here if you'd like to. And I stitch the binding to the bag, make that first row of stitching. When you come to the corners, you're going to miter those just the way you would if you were binding a quilt. I'm not going to take the time to do that for you right now. But this is how I finish this end, so you get a really nice, neat finish. Instead of just bringing the binding over and folding it ready to stitch down, I'm actually going to fold that end of my binding in and over the bottom edge of my tech pouch. Then when I fold the binding, I hope you can see you get a nice finish there on the bottom edge. Everything is tucked inside the binding, so nothing's going to show. And then I can take this to the machine, and with my straight stitch again, just edge stitch right along the fold of the binding. So that's how the end of the bag will be finished with the binding. And let me take just a second and I'll show you how to do one of those miters. So when we come to the corner, we'll just start on the other side of my binding. Now, one thing I forgot to do that can be really handy when you're sewing through all these thicknesses is to lengthen your stitch just a little bit. And that's because the machine actually has to work a little bit harder to push this, to move the material through. So sometimes it makes the stitches shorter than the setting would indicate. So you can go a little bit longer than usual. Now I'm going to stop sewing 1/4 of an inch before I get to this next raw edge. And I like to back stitch just to be sure that stays in place. Then I'm going to fold my miter, and instead of folding it back on itself the way I would if this were a 90-degree angle, I'm going to fold it so that my fold line is sort of at the center of that angle. And then fold again, and this time it's to match up the raw edges along the bag, and then I'm ready to start sewing on the next part of my corner, on the next part of my binding. Then after you have this binding sewn in place, the first set of stitches, when you go to fold this over to the wrong side, you have that nice little miter at the corners. I hope you'll have a good time making yourself a tech pouch and that all of your things will be protected. You can change these to any size you need, no matter what kind of gear you're carrying with you.